Hello, Agape Church and friends. Welcome into the Building Up podcast. This is episode number 103. I am David McConnell, the lead pastor at Agape Church in Pinson. Thank you guys for being with us, as always, on the podcast. As we record this, it is a rainy and thunderstorm type day outside. So if you hear that roar in the background, that's what's going on. Hopefully it will not hinder you being able to get something out of this episode of the podcast. We are going to be looking today at chapter 21 of the wise sayings in the Old Testament book of Proverbs. We are over halfway through now, all of these wise sayings. And we have, after today, we'll have 10 chapters left. We've been going through these together and looking at some of the big picture themes or central proverbs in each one of the chapters. And so hopefully you found this to be beneficial if you have been following along. I do think reading the chapter before the podcast, or at least right after, is an act that will help you get the most out of what we are trying to do together. So let's dive into chapter 21. Lots of themes that I saw in this chapter in Proverbs, including some themes that we have addressed before: the providence of God, Proverbs around worship, around family, around the violent acts or the violent tendencies of wicked people, controlling our tongue. We seem to get Proverbs almost every chapter that have to do with the necessity of trying to control our mouths and what we say. Some general proverbs on living wisely. And then one of the kind of main theme I want to drill into today is the theme of gaining treasure and being a generous person. There were quite a few proverbs in chapter 21 that deal with this theme. So let's jump right in. Beginning with verse 5 in chapter 21, and also a connected proverb in verse 29. This says in verse 5, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." So I think what we see here is the principle of wisdom that wise people plan. They make plans. They are diligent with their plans. They are thinking things through, and ultimately they will have an abundance out of that. Now, of course, this pointing to material gain, but I also like to look at these proverbs in the thinking through spiritual treasure, spiritual gain. The wise people who are disciplined and they plan and they think about their lives and they think about the time they're spending with the Lord, and they train themselves for godliness, as Paul told Timothy to do. I think those are the people that receive an abundance of spiritual treasure. But foolish people rush into things very quickly. They don't think things out very well. Verse 29 in Proverbs says they put on a bold face, and that is in contention with the wise person who gives thought to his ways. So in other words, they rush into things. They don't think it through. They put on the type of face that is, they're confident, they know what they're doing, but they really, really haven't taken time to discern their lives and discern what they're doing. And ultimately, it leads to lack. They gain things quickly. They lose things quickly. It leads to poverty, not abundance. And so you can apply that to the material world. I think you can apply that to the spiritual realm and spiritual treasures as well. It is important for us to think about our lives, ask good questions, make plans, train ourselves, and to do those things looking to the Lord, not as a person with arrogance or boldness, but rather a person with humility, that we are humble before the Lord. That doesn't mean that we are sheepish in going before Him, because Hebrews tells us because of what Jesus has done, we can go before His throne with confidence. But it does mean that that confidence is not in ourselves. The confidence is we are accepted because we have humbled ourselves before God through faith in Jesus. and we can go before him daily. We can ask for his help, and we can plan our lives out and how we can receive treasure, and God will give us an abundance. That's what these passages seem to be pointing us to. All right, verse 6 says, similarly, the getting of treasure by a lying tongue is a fleeting vapor and a snare of death. So again, here's someone who's trying to get gain through deception, through shortcuts. They're not interested in doing that wise planning we just talked about. They're not interested in trying to be disciplined and trained and to do things to slowly, consistently gain. Rather, they want to take the path of least resistance. They're deceptive, and ultimately it leads to their destruction. Even if they do gain something, it doesn't last very long. If we connect this back to chapter 20, and a proverb we didn't talk about in that chapter, but from chapter 20, verse 17, it says, bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be full of gravel. So again, kind of a same principle there, that if you gain something by deceptive practices, it may be enjoyable for a moment, but eventually it's going to be like chewing gravel. The sweetness of what you think you've gotten is not going to last. And so not only are you going to perhaps lose what you have tried to gain quickly, but you're not even going to be able to really enjoy it in the process. So again, these proverbs are pointing us to being wise people who seek out gain and treasure through right ways, just ways, diligent ways, rather than to try to gain something as quickly as we can. And again, I think we can apply that to all aspects of our lives. Verse 20 in chapter 21 says that precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. All right, so again, here's a proverb that tells us that wise people, they know how to use their resources well. They know how to use the things that they are gaining through their diligence and their planning from the hand of God. As God gives them these good gifts, they know how to enjoy them in the right way. So their house is filled with treasure and oil, where a foolish person doesn't have those things because they've devoured it. So at least in part, this is pointing us to the importance of being wise with what we have and knowing when to save something, when to enjoy it in moderation, and when to use it. Where a foolish person, because they want to get things as quick as they can, they also use things as quick as they can. They devour it as quickly as they can. And so they don't have anything good in their home. A wise person is storing things up, saving things up, using it in moderation, enjoying it in moderation, and being wise about what they've collected. Verse 17 shows us similar principle. It says, whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. Whoever loves wine and oil will not be rich. Same principle there. Why, if you love wine and oil, will you not be rich? Why, if you love pleasure, will you be a poor person? It's because you're using up every gift you get as quickly as you get it, and you're not actually using it in a sound and wise way, whether that may be saving it or enjoying it in moderation. You're just using it up as quickly as you can. We know that this is not telling us that it's wrong to love pleasure or to love the gifts of the Lord, because there are plenty of passages, including Ecclesiastes, by the way, that tells us that God gives good gifts to his children. So things like pleasure, things like good wine, are symbolic of God giving good gifts, and that we should enjoy those good gifts. So that's where I'm using the word moderation. I remember years ago, my mentor and my pastor teaching, and I can remember him saying that, you receive things from God open-handedly. Imagine like it being placed into your hand, and your hand is open. You never want to put your fist around it or grasp it to the place to where it's like God's given this to me, I'm never going to let it go, because We're to be open-handed with God. He puts things into our possession, and then sometimes he'll call us to give up those things, which we're going to see some Proverbs about that in just a moment. But every good gift that he gives, some of those gifts he gives us to enjoy them. They're for us. But some of the gifts that God gives us, they're for others. He gives them to us and puts them in our possession because he intends for us to give them away. So a wise person knows how to live in moderation. They know how to enjoy the gifts that God has given them. I don't think the Bible tells us to save every single thing. As a matter of fact, if we do that, we're not going to be generous people. If we store up everything like we won't have anything tomorrow, I think it shows a sign of not really trusting God. But on the other hand, if we're a foolish person, we're going to devour everything we get. We're going to spend everything we get as soon as we get it. And that may be material, but you can look at that in other areas of your life as well. And we're going to use it as fast as we get it. We're never going to be able to save. And so we're not going to have maybe what God intends for us to have at a later time, or even what God wants us to give away to others. And that's, I think, what these Proverbs are pointing us to. Enjoying the gifts of God appropriately and not loving pleasure and oil and wine, the good gifts of the earth, to an excess. Because if we love those things excessively, then we're going to hold on to them tightly, and we're not going to be able to live the kinds of lives that God has called us to, which includes being generous to others. Look at verse 13 in chapter 21. Whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered. So in the principle of you will reap what you sow, Proverbs says it is wise, those people who listen to the poor, who listen to the cries of the poor. And those foolish people who love their gifts and love pleasure and devour everything they get, they don't save anything. They're not generous with anything. And even when they hear the poor crying out, they ignore them. Proverbs says eventually they're going to find themselves in need. Eventually they're going to cry out themselves for help, and they're not going to receive it. In verse 25 and 26 warns us of something similar, bringing the character type of the sluggard or the lazy person back into our view. And we've seen this character type many times throughout Proverbs. But the desire of the sluggard kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. All day long he craves and craves. But the righteous gives and does not hold back. So again, we're seeing two character types being contrasted here. The sluggard is the lazy person who they may love pleasure, they may love good gifts, they don't really want to work for anything. So they spend their life, they crave. If they get something, they spend it, they devour it as quickly as they get it. They desire. They don't really labor for anything. They just wait for someone to give them something, and then they use it. The righteous person, however, we know that they are diligent, as we've already seen. They're making plans. They're training themselves. They're seeking after treasure in a good, right, consistent way. As they receive in abundance, they know how to enjoy it, and they know how to give it away. They know how to save it up, and they know how to be generous with it. They give, and when they give, they don't hold back. In other words, they give what God lays on their heart to give. They're not afraid of, okay, well, God's told me to give this amount, but I better save a little bit for tomorrow just in case. They're free to say, this is what God has told me to give, so I'm going to give it. Because the God who gave it to me today is going to be there to provide tomorrow. So they are able to give. Their desires are not clouding their judgment. Their cravings for pleasure and good things are not hindering them from being a wise and generous person, because their cravings and their desires are being, they submit those things to the Lord, and God helps them to desire and to crave the right things in the right way. And we can end this with verse 21. Whoever pursues righteousness and kindness will find life, righteousness, and honor. So whoever pursues right living and right standing before God and kindness to others, they will reap what they're sowing, and they will find being returned to them by the Lord abundant life, righteousness, and even honor from God and from their fellow man. So I hope this has been helpful as we've looked at gaining treasure and being generous people as principles of wisdom in chapter 21 of Proverbs. Thank you for being with us on this episode. I hope you will join us for the next one. Until then, grace and peace to your family.
Thank you for listening to the Building Up podcast, a ministry of Agape Church in Pinson, Alabama. If you have a question about today's podcast or would like to suggest a topic for the future, please email us, buildingup@agapepinson.com. To subscribe to this podcast, simply search for Building Up from Agape Church in your favorite podcast app.
So fierce, he looked straight into me and said, "Son, I'm giving you victory. I can